Welcome, come in, take a seat, have some tea, can I get you something? Some cookies, biscuits, how about some cinnamon rolls? Listen, I hope it's not too jarring seeing a breakdown like this covered on this channel, but I'll do my best to keep it brief. I'd like to take you through a semi-technical breakdown of each game in the Super Mario 3D All-Stars collection, particularly with regards to how they compare to other contemporary methods of playing the games, as well as generally how the changes affect the quality of the games as they come to the Switch. Best to start at the beginning then, with Super Mario 64.
It's me, Mario!
According to Nintendo's own specifications of the game, Super Mario 64 runs at a 1280 by 720 pixel resolution both when in handheld mode and while docked. That doesn't sound great right off the bat, and the actual pixel count is much smaller due to the fact the game runs in a 4:3 aspect ratio, with black borders on all sides of the image. Considering that there's been a very simple widescreen code for the game which players have been using for years, it's hard to imagine why Nintendo didn't bother to implement this simple change. It's even harder to imagine why the game won't run at 1080p even when in docked mode, when we know the Switch is more than powerful enough to do that. Now, if you've come to watch this video, then chances are that you've already seen Digital Foundry's technical breakdown of the collection, so I won't harp on points they've already made. But, if you have seen it, you'll probably remember hearing this line.
More importantly, input latency is kept to a minimum. The game feels suitably responsive and quick, as it should.
So, this statement bothers me quite a bit, for two reasons. Firstly, they give no specific numbers for latency measurements, only a subjective statement that the game feels suitably responsive. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, the game's latency is terrible! It's not good, and it does not, by any means, feel suitably responsive, but let's go over the numbers and explain why I feel that way. When measured using a 120fps camera, from contact point to first detected frame of movement, this is the spread of latency frames, ordered from least to greatest. Now, because the game was tested in handheld mode, variable display lag due to a specific setup is removed. As you see, Mario 64's latency comes out to be between 13 and 17 frames out of 120fps. This translates to a lag time between 108.3 milliseconds and 141.7 milliseconds, rounded to the nearest tenth of a millisecond. Keep in mind that the range of measurements seen, 4 frames out of 120fps, is due to the frame rate the game runs at, which is 30fps, and is not just a wide estimate of the true value. Depending on whether the input gets processed by the game internally right before the screen refreshes or right after, there should be a maximum of 1 frame out of 30fps variance in latency measurements. 1 frame out of 30fps is equivalent to 4 frames out of 120fps, which is why we see this exact spread of values. So, what does this mean? This means, at best, the game will take a full tenth of a second to respond to your inputs, but for context, remember when the Mega Man X Legacy Collection came out and it was put on blast for having high latency? Well, these are the numbers measured by people at the time, and as you can see, they're almost identical to the average latency playing Mario 64, at least on the Switch. In the end, as a result of the frame rate and the input latency combined, the controls of the game feel really atrocious. This is especially damning when you compare its performance to the unofficial Switch port of Super Mario 64. This version of the game, compiled by fans, responds almost twice as quickly as Nintendo's affair, with the latency numbers shown here. The latency, as you can see here, is between 8 and 10 frames out of 120fps, which equates to 66.7 to 83.3 milliseconds of lag. As a result, I'm able to pull off this bomb trick on the first try, where it took me many times on the All-Stars version. I didn't even get it in the end, I just died. Not only is the latency better, but this fan port runs at an unshakable 60fps in both handheld and docked modes, and it has full 16:9 support, which runs at 1080p while docked. Just looking at the comparison between the two running side by side is like night and day. I know the footage here shows Mario with a new, higher poly model, but keep in mind that that's an optional feature I chose to include in my own personal copy, and is being ignored for the sake of this comparison. There are more downsides to the All-Stars Mario 64 emulation, like the texture filtering inaccuracies, the slight audio latency on certain actions, etc., but I don't want to harp on points that have been made elsewhere, and honestly, in the face of other issues, I'd consider those pretty minor. What I don't consider minor, however, is the fact that the ROM is based on the Shindo version of the game, meaning backwards long jumps are patched out. That's just a bad time. Moving on to the GameCube's Mario Sunshine, it unfortunately follows a similar fate in the collection as 64. Latency here is identical to that of 64, and as you'd imagine, it has a similar effect on the gameplay. Despite how responsive Sunshine usually feels to play, in part due to the smaller controller dead zone and lack of as much motion easing on Mario's movements as compared to 64 and Galaxy, it still feels horribly unresponsive and clunky due to the input latency of All-Stars emulation. Critically, the game also runs at 30fps, despite the Switch being more than capable of running it at 60. Indeed, even for the original GameCube release, there are relatively short gecko codes to boost the frame rate to 60fps. While the code works really well for the most part, there are apparently some minor elements with animations tied to the frame rate which behave unnaturally at 60 FPS, but if Nintendo had the inclination, it would have been trivial to modify their source code and build a new ROM without these glitches. They wouldn't even need to make it a full port, and it could have just stayed as emulation. In the end, just about the only thing that Sunshine's emulation package has over 64s is that it has widescreen support and it runs 1080p when docked. It's an improvement, if however slight. Galaxy, though. Galaxy's a complicated one to look at. It arguably had to go through the most changes to accommodate the difference in control scheme from the Wii to the Switch, and for the most part, those changes have actually done pretty well. First of all, let's talk about the performance. Galaxy runs at a locked 60 FPS on Switch with 1080p docked resolution and 720p handheld. In terms of input latency, it fares so much better than 64 or Sunshine. Taking measurements using the same methodology, Galaxy has this spread of lag frames from button contact to action. The range here is from 7 to 9 frames out of 120 FPS, which equates to 58.3 to 75 milliseconds, which is a massive improvement from the other games in this collection. Because of the frame rate and the tolerable latency, I have hours more footage of Galaxy than I do of both Mario 64 and Sunshine combined, just because playing either of those past the first stages was frankly painful, where playing Galaxy actually feels like I'm playing a game. But what is it that makes this perform so much better than the other games? What's the difference between Galaxy and 64 and Sunshine when it comes to technical performance in this collection? Well, I have a strong feeling that the latency is down to how the games are emulated, or more specifically, how Galaxy isn't fully an emulation. Well, hold on, how's something be half an emulation, or is partly an emulation? Well, that's actually a good question. Apparently, according to Oatmeal Dome on Twitter, while 64 and Sunshine are running in an emulator, Galaxy has apparently had its CPU instructions rewritten for the Switch, with its GPU instructions and audio instructions handled via emulation. It's for this reason I greatly think that we get so much better latency with Galaxy on the Switch collection as opposed to 64 and Sunshine. Now, I mentioned the controls before, and you might be curious to know how they're adapted for the Switch. After all, Galaxy made frequent use of the cursor to pick up star bits and navigate menus, so how does the Switch handle it? Well, docked mode has the most clean and simple means, by using the gyroscope in the Pro Controller to direct the cursor. You can also use any third-party controller with gyro support. I used, an 8-bit controller myself. It's pretty good. The ZR button is used to fire star bits, and the R button is used to recenter the cursor on the screen, since there's no IR sensor bar to prevent drift. Honestly, I didn't expect to feel fully comfortable with this control scheme, but it worked remarkably well to the point where it started to feel second nature. The cursor rarely drifted, and when it did, resyncing it was as easy as pressing one button. As far as trans-console adaptation of motion controls go, I think they did the best job they could. You can shake the Joy-Con to perform a spin, as in the original release, but you can also do it by pressing either X or Y. This makes spinning come out just a bit more quickly and reliably than it did on the Wii, and I very much appreciate the change. Specifically when it comes to dock mode, I really can't think of any significant criticism to either the controls or the performance. It genuinely gets an A+ in my book. I wish I could say the same for handheld controls, but they fare ever so slightly worse. Still good, but not amazing. Since using the gyroscope functionality would be inconvenient while holding the screen you're trying to look at, the cursor is controlled exclusively via the touchscreen. Dragging your finger across the screen moves the cursor, and then tapping fires a star bit. The problems with this method are twofold. Your hand will have to leave one side of the console, meaning you either can't move while using the cursor or can't jump or attack. Additionally, my hand also ends up covering a lot of the screen, making seeing where you're going or what you're doing a pretty big challenge. It's not the worst solution, but I'd have also preferred the method to make use of the redundant buttons, like holding L while using the right stick to direct the cursor. One thing I think really ought to have been changed is the fact that selecting galaxies and choosing to save your game can't be done without the cursor. Considering how often it comes up, not patching in some way to make menu selections with the left stick seems like an oversight. A small mistake, don't get me wrong, but it does bring down the experience slightly. So, the conclusion. How would I rate the ports/emulations of the games currently in the 3D All-Stars collection? I'll start with Super Mario 64. 2 out of 10. It's pretty terrible, honestly, with the only thing positive I can say being that it plays. You know, you can get from one end of the game to another. Compared to any of the other ways of playing Super Mario 64 in this day and age, it comes up painfully short. Even against its own unofficial Switch port, it's kind of an outright embarrassment. No widescreen, no 1080p, no 60 FPS, and tons of input latency make me feel like this rendition of Super Mario 64 doesn't really add a cent to the value of this collection. Next up, Super Mario Sunshine. 3 out of 10. Almost everything wrong with 64 can be applied here, with the only edge coming from the added widescreen and 1080p. Other than that, this is still 30 FPS and still bogged by input lag. If you're gonna play Super Mario Sunshine, don't play it this way, honestly. And finally, to close things off, what score would I give Super Mario Galaxy in the 3D All-Stars collection? Honestly, if I had to think about it, I'd probably give it somewhere around an 8.5 out of 10. It's remarkably quite decent. The latency is acceptable, it's 60 FPS, and its controls have been adapted remarkably well for a smooth experience. Compared to the zero-effort showings of 64 and Sunshine, I'd actually consider this an entirely viable way to play Super Mario Galaxy. So, with Super Mario Galaxy being the only game here even worthy of your time, let alone your money, is the 3D All-Stars collection even worth it? Well, if you're willing to pay $60 for a good port of Galaxy, and it is a very good port, then I guess so, but in my opinion, the other games here are way too shoddy to even bother with. I'd just save your money.